All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. Chapter 22, The Early Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1851. We'll be looking at Section 1, Causes of the Industrial Revolution. So we've got here just pretty much a laundry list of all the causes for the Industrial Revolution. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll talk a little bit more about these things in detail, but let's go ahead and just define this term, the Industrial Revolution, because it is a rather important and significant event in world history. In fact, it's arguably the second most important event in the history of Homo sapiens. The first one being perhaps the discovery of farming. That happened roughly, we'll say 8,000 BCE. And that was when human societies transitioned from hunter-gatherers, in which they were roaming around, to growing their own agriculture, which allowed for the construction of civilization, permanent structures, class structures, all the things that characterize civilization was because of farming. The second most important change in all of human history, again, is this Industrial Revolution. And we could say roughly 1750 till about, depending on what part of the world we're talking about, 1900 or so. Currently, there might still be parts of the world that we could characterize as non-industrial or industrializing even today. So it's much more of a process rather than sort of a moment in history, so to speak. But 1750 is usually a good year to keep in mind for when the Industrial Revolution begins. Anyway, so what is the Industrial Revolution then? Well, if we just have to give it sort of a very straightforward definition, we would say the Industrial Revolution changed the way goods are produced and distributed. Right, so on sort of a very, very basic level, the Industrial Revolution is changing the way that things are made and that they're transported. And this has all sorts of different kind of side effects to where it affects things like society. It affects things like, of course, the economy. It affects things like culture. It affects things like family life. Right? And so just this basic changing in the way that goods are made and changing in the way that goods are transported, it ends up having this ripple effect throughout pretty much any industrial society. So first of all, let's talk about actually before we get to the causes, the fundamental thing that is changing here, again, if we were to kind of narrow this down even more, is what we might call the source of power. Now that means all throughout human history, essentially, up until the 1750s, things were created, that is made, or people got around, transported things, pretty much from one of four power sources. The first one was what we might call we'll actually say human power. So people could essentially walk from point A to point B, or in the case of making things, everything before the Industrial Revolution was handmade, right? Every single thing was made by hand. That was using human power in order to do that. Other ways include animal power. It would be something like riding a horse to get around. Wind power, think of a sail. A windmill also could be used to produce something. And water power, right? And more or less since the beginning of human history, up until the 1750s, essentially, any four of these types of power sources, where the power was coming from when making things or getting from point A to point B, were used. The Industrial Revolution is when this thing is replaced by essentially the steam engine. And the steam engine is a contraption in which you take coal, right? You put coal in the steam engine, you burn it, and then it produces a piston mechanism, right? Allowing you to create an engine, essentially. And it's using the steam engine to replace all of these things is essentially the basis for what the Industrial Revolution is, right? This invention is key and vital to it. So what does it take for the steam engine to be not only invented, but actually useful? And these are all sort of the preconditions that we can talk about. So in terms of population, in order for industrialization to take place, there has to be enough people to work and consume. Right, that is a precondition. There needs to be people who can work in factories, for example, that utilize steam engines. That means that they're free up from other tasks. That's why, for example, in a hunting and gathering society, something like the Industrial Revolution couldn't take place because every single person in those types of societies are dedicated to survival, right? Whereas in societies with larger populations, where people have the ability to work and also to consume, this is possible. Natural resources is required, namely coal, right? Some parts of the world just don't have the resources there. All these other preconditions could be met, but without coal, it's not going to be possible. Demand for goods, that is the incentive to produce more. You need to have somebody to buy all the things made by the steam engine. An agricultural revolution, this sort of ties in with population a little bit, but essentially this means more efficient farming, right? And that leads to, on the one hand, more people, but also less farmers. So for example, you compare a place like Great Britain, which didn't have the largest population in the world. I mean, London becomes the most populous city the world had ever seen during the industrial period, but places like China had more people. The difference was that in Britain, an agricultural revolution actually led to less people involved in farming that allowed more people to be freed up to do other things, namely like work into factories. There also is a requirement of an expansion and accessibility of trade. This could play two ways. This could mean access to resources, but also what we call markets. And, this is going to be a very strong theme. For industrial revolution to take place, there has to be people to sell goods to. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to increase production in the way that industrialization does. And an openness to innovation. We might see this as the ability for the government to, in most cases, on the one hand, incentivize, but really just to kind of stay out, to leave an economy unregulated, so there is not things like religious or traditional ideology that goes against kind of this openness to new ideas, openness to innovation, openness to technology. And so all of these things were evident in the area where the Industrial Revolution took place first, and that was Great Britain. All right, Great Britain. So we see all these things happening in Great Britain, roughly 1700 to, again, 1760 or so. So the population in Britain grew in part due to new crops like the potato. This was from the New World, of course. The introduction of the potato increased populations everywhere, including Great Britain. The agricultural revolution made agriculture, again, more efficient. Another thing that it also did was it made land valuable. And this wasn't necessarily in just what we might think of agriculture, but this was also with England's wool industry. And so what England did when land became more valuable, when farming became more efficient, it could, in order to support a population, it required less workers, but in fact could take up more land, was this process of enclosure. And enclosure was the what we might call the privatizing. Privatizing of common lands, right? So during the medieval period, there wasn't really a strong emphasis on land ownership. There were a lot of these common lands where people lived, where they grew their crops, et cetera, et cetera. But because there was becoming a much more commercial, or Britain was being linked much more commercially with the rest of the world, because farmland was being used more efficiently in the agricultural revolution, this led to a lot of the common lands being enclosed, that is to put up fences around them. And what this caused was that people then had to move, and they moved primarily to the city, and that provided a labor force for which a lot of these factories could take place. Now, of course, we talked about in previous chapters about the expansion of trade and the incentive to trade. You know, really when we talked about the colonial, or we'll say the colonies and triangle trade. You know, we talked about this in a previous chapter. So this commercial expansion, the creation of colonies, like we said before, for Great Britain, both gave them resources. You know, we already talked about this, things like tobacco, sugar, and a crop that will become increasingly important after the Industrial Revolution, and that is cotton. Of course, for Great Britain, they had a territory in India, they had territory in North America. The British also had territory in the Caribbean, right? And all these colonies provided resources, but at the same time, they also provided markets that people were living in these areas all wanted to buy things. And that gave England an incentive to produce, especially things like porcelain, for example. Textiles are a big thing. Many people living in the British colonies produce resources, but also require, or want, I should say, goods. Now, typically up until that point, all goods were made by skilled artisans. A skilled artisan is a person who makes things with their hands, right? And when artisans produce something, it's a very, very expensive process, right? So we might say a handmade good, and this is, you know, this kind of comes from our intuition. If something is handmade, it's going to cost a lot of money. And at the same time, if every single, let's just use shirts, for example, if every single shirt is produced handmade, well, then there's not going to be an ability to really make a lot of these things, right? So you're going to get a few number of shirts made for a very, very expensive price. Well, in England, producers started to figure out ways to cut down on the cost to make it less expensive. This is known as proto-industrialization. We might think of proto-industrialization as like the, not really the beginnings of industrialization, but a more efficient, pre-industrial production. All right, that's just what we'll call it, right? Pre-industrial production. It involved technologies like spinning wheels and looms. A spinning wheel is something that takes something like wool and turns it into thread. A loom is something that then takes that thread and turns it into cloth, right? And then finally, the cloth is then taken and turned into a shirt, right? So this is more or less the process by which a t-shirt gets made. The wool needs to come off of a sheep. The wool then needs to be turned into thread. The thread is then woven into a cloth, and that cloth is then turned into a shirt. As far as technology goes, right, this process right here from wool to thread, that's where the spinning comes in. To take that thread and then produce it into both cloth and then later a t-shirt, that is where the loom comes in. Now, typically, historically speaking, this entire process, right, from taking the wool all the way to the finished product, this was all done by the artisan, right? He did all of those things. What proto-industrialization did, and maybe we'll use a different color here to mark it, we'll use purple, right? What proto-industrialization did was to separate these tasks. So instead, this part of taking the wool and turning it into thread, this was given to farmers. And in fact, in England, they took a lot of these spinning wheels and they put it out in these rural farm families. They would bring the family's wool. The families would then turn that wool into thread. They'd be giving a little bit of money, a lot less money than what the artisans made, And then they could take that thread and give it to somebody who had perhaps maybe a loom, right? And so even the process of taking a thread and turning it into cloth, this was also done or could be done by a farmer. The only process in proto-industrialization that was done at the artisan level was this last process, right? And that was taking the cloth and making it to a shirt, because again, that was something that was a lot more difficult to do, right? You know, not any typical farmer could make something as quality as a t-shirt, but could do something as simple as turn wool into thread. And so whereas this process right here of the artisan doing the whole thing, right, we got our $5 signs, right? This costs a lot more. By outsourcing the labor to farmers, or at least parts of the labor, spinning it and putting some of it into cloth, this process could then cost less money. And so it allowed for more goods to be produced for a much cheaper cost. And this is essentially what the Industrial Revolution is trying to get at here. Of course, this was all possible because of turnpikes and canals in which Great Britain built. If you're not familiar, a turnpike is a road. A canal is a man-made river. All right, so again, when we think about all the preconditions that are required for the Industrial Revolution to take place, all of these things rely on the ability to transport. And if it wasn't economically efficient to transport goods, then a lot of this wouldn't have taken place. So turnpikes and canals, the fact that Great Britain had a lot of them, the fact that Great Britain, as we look here, is an island, and that you can more easily send goods by sea than you can by land, certainly benefited the British in a lot of ways. The fact they had a lot of rivers benefited the British in a lot of ways. And this is where something like geography comes into play. So when we look at when industrialization started to take hold in Great Britain, again, it is the use of steam engines to create. Now, if we take this whole process and say, well, if we make this process done all by the steam engine, which is effectively what the Industrial Revolution does, not only do we get a lot more in terms of the quantity that's produced, right? Because a machine can produce a lot more than one person with their hands, but it's also done for a much, much cheaper price, right? And so when push comes to shove, and people are given the option of buying the $5 shirt, the $3 shirt, or the $1 shirt, it's always going to be the one produced by the steam engine. Now, initially, this transformation took place first in Great Britain, but did then spread to continental Europe and later on the United States. The textile industry is the first industry to be affected by the Industrial Revolution and the steam engine. However, it comes to affect pretty much production of every single type of good, from furniture to guns to whatever it is that you're referring to. And it was able to flourish in Great Britain due to a lot of various reasons, especially when compared to other parts around the world. One of the biggest questions in world history is, well, why did Great Britain go through the Industrial Revolution first? Because this ability to produce for a lot cheaper and produce a lot more gives the British a huge advantage over everybody else in the world. So this has been a massively consequential question in world history, probably one of the most studied. And we can just look at some of the characteristics of Great Britain that really allowed it to flourish. So for example, all of these things that allowed for the expansion of the industrial industry or period already existed, right? Banks, stocks, insurance. We might say the patent system. This might be something unique. A patent is a legal protection for an invention. So for example, if you invent something, then filing for a patent means the government will protect that invention and you can profit off it. So knowing that you can make it rich essentially by creating new inventions, that gives people the incentive, right, to invent. Whereas if it was very easy for somebody just to steal your idea, why invent in the first place? Because somebody's probably going to steal it and make money off of your hard work. So this was something that was perhaps unique to Britain, but not exclusive, as there are patent laws in other nations. But the system of finance, banks, stock markets, insurance, all of these things, back in the 1600s, these were all done for trade voyages, right? In the 1800s, all of these things are being used for building factories, right? Which again have still the same motive, but are being used a little bit differently. And essentially what a factory is that, let's look at this process of production here. So there are technologies like spinning wheels, right? There are technologies like looms. Back during the proto-industrial period, these things were powered by hand. Some for a poor farmer would be sitting in their home spinning with their hand this contraption that would take wool and turn it into thread. And then also some poor farmer would be taking that thread and turning it into cloth right inside in their home. Essentially what the factory is that you can take essentially multiple spinning jennings, right? So let's say you have spinning wheels, right? Times 100, you have 100 of them. You have power looms, right? Times 100. But instead of getting 200 people to work with their hands and spin all of these things, that's where the steam engine comes in. And the steam engine is connected to all of these devices in a way that as long as the steam engine is going, it can power all of these things. And of course, you can see how this would create then just really a massive amount of goods being produced. These things were expensive, right? To build a factory, this is essentially what the factory is. This required banks to give out loans. This required corporations in which investors, right? So instead of people pooling their resources together in something like the British East India Company to trade tea in England, people pooled their resources together to get a steam engine, buy 100 spinning wheels, buy 100 power looms, and then having these sort of supply chain that would bring in things like wool, bring in things like cotton, and produce t-shirts for a profit. England had all of those things, right? All of those institutions that were required existed in England before industrialization took place. Another thing that is specific to England, especially compared to their European neighbors, a weak aristocracy, that is a weak king/nobility. So for example, in places like Spain and France, where the king was absolute, they could tax whatever they want, whenever they want. In England, given the history of the English Civil War and the way that Parliament really exerted their power over the monarch, this allows for a little bit more reassurance that the powerful nobles won't undermine this new industrial class. Again, we talked about these things earlier: coastlines, rivers, canals, coal and iron ore. This just comes down to geography, right? Great Britain was lucky in that they had massive coal fields, right? This map right here of England is showing you some of the areas in which there was a lot of coal underneath the ground. I mean, in some cases, it's either there's coal in the ground or there's not. And, England was lucky in that way. And lastly, one thing that kept England separate from their European neighbors, that was warfare. Pretty much from 1790 to 1815, Europe was at war. We'll talk about that at a later chapter. But war was especially disruptive, right? It was disruptive to any sort of inventors trying to invest. It was disruptive to, maybe even the factories themselves. And so because England was able to kind of stay away across the English Channel from this conflict, allowed industrialization to go at a much more rapid pace.